There's a peculiar kind of quiet burden a man carries, heavier sometimes than any physical load. It's the one born not from what he has done, but from what he hasn't dared to do. It settles in his shoulders, a silent weight that grows year by year, gradually shaping him, not into the man he once imagined he could be, but into a shadow of that potential. It's the insidious tax levied on a life lived too safely, a gradual erosion of spirit where the comfort of the known morphs into a cage, and the perceived freedom from risk turns out to be the most binding chain of all. We wrap ourselves in the warm blanket of routine, convincing ourselves that stability is freedom, a fortress against the unpredictable pain of failure. But beneath that logic, a different truth brews, a simmering, unspoken fear of trying, of perhaps not measuring up. And the cost of that fear, though invisible on any ledger, is paid in the currency of what if. There's a peculiar kind of quiet burden a man carries, heavier sometimes than any physical load. It's the one born not from what he has done, but from what he hasn't dared to do. It settles in his shoulders, a silent weight that grows year by year, gradually shaping him, not into the man he once imagined he could be, but into a shadow of that potential. It's the insidious tax levied on a life lived too safely, a gradual erosion of spirit where the comfort of the known morphs into a cage, and the perceived freedom from risk turns out to be the most binding chain of all. We wrap ourselves in the warm blanket of routine, convincing ourselves that stability is freedom, a fortress against the unpredictable pain of failure. But beneath that logic, a different truth brews, a simmering, unspoken fear of trying, of perhaps not measuring up. And the cost of that fear, though invisible on any ledger, is paid in the currency of what if. And this burden, this quiet weight of what if, it was one Hector knew better than most. He was 48 years old, a factory man through and through, the kind you'd pass on the street and barely notice, not because he was forgettable, but because he'd learned to blend, to occupy just enough space to get by, no more, no less. He looked like a man built for endurance, broad shoulders slightly stooped, as if perpetually braced for a load that hadn't quite arrived yet, or maybe had always been there, just invisible. His face was a roadmap of long days and longer nights. Lines etched around his eyes from years of peering at assembly lines, a permanent furrow between his brows from silent concentration or worry. There was a resilience in him, a solid, oak-like quality, but overlaid with a weariness that seeped into his very bones, a weariness that wasn't just physical but born of a spirit that had long denied itself flight. His hands, those were the real storytellers, knuckles thick and gnarled, skin like worn leather, crisscrossed with 1,000 small scars from forgotten snags and scrapes. They were hands that had built things, fixed things, provided. Strong hands, capable hands, but also hands that had, perhaps, never quite reached for what they truly yearned to grasp, to shape wood into graceful furniture, to coax intricate patterns from metal, to create rather than merely assemble. And his eyes, a deep, faded hazel, usually guarded, were the windows to that quiet burden. They saw everything, missed little, but rarely gave anything away. In their depths, if you looked close enough, you might catch a flicker, a ghost of an ambition long since banked, a longing for something more than the rhythmic clang and hiss of the factory floor. They were the eyes of a man who had observed the world from the sidelines, content, or so he told himself, with the safety of the known, even as an unspoken hunger gnawed at the edges of his peace. He moved through life with a sort of practiced invisibility, a man who preferred the background hum to the spotlight. At the factory, he was the guy you could always count on to show up, do the work, never complain. A reliable cog in a vast machine. Dependable. That's what people said about Hector. But dependable often masked a deeper truth, a fear of standing out, of drawing attention that might demand he step beyond the familiar, the safe. He rarely offered an opinion unasked, choosing instead to listen, to observe, processing the world around him with an almost surgical precision, filing away details others missed. There was a solidity to him, a kind of weathered strength, like an old oak that had seen countless seasons. But like that oak deeply rooted, he rarely allowed himself to imagine branching out too far, too wildly. The idea of uprooting, of venturing into unknown soil, felt not like freedom, but like a terrifying vulnerability. He'd always believed that keeping his head down, sticking to the path, was the smartest way to navigate life's unpredictable currents. No big splashes, no big risks, no big falls. That was his philosophy, hammered into him by years of watching others try, and sometimes spectacularly fail. He had seen the wreckage of grand ambitions, the bitter taste of dreams turned sour, and had quietly resolved to spare himself and his family that particular brand of pain. Better the dull ache of an unlived dream than the sharp wound of a broken one, he reasoned. In his quiet moments, usually after Maria and the kids, Alina and Leo, were asleep, the factory noise still echoing faintly in his ears, he'd sometimes let his mind wander. He'd picture a different life, a workshop perhaps with the scent of sawdust and fresh-cut wood, his hands crafting something beautiful and lasting, not just assembling parts. He had a knack for it, a good eye, a steady hand. He'd even sketched designs once, hidden away in a shoebox under his bed, intricate, thoughtful pieces that pulsed with a creativity he rarely unleashed. But then the harsh light of dawn would break and the practicalities would flood in. The mortgage, the groceries, the school uniforms, the car repairs. The sheer weight of responsibility, the relentless demands of the present, always seemed to crush the fragile bloom of those what-if dreams before they could take root. Risk, to Hector, was an indulgence, a luxury only afforded by those who didn't carry the weight of a family, the burden of a mortgage, the constant hum of bills that needed to be paid on time every month. He saw stability not just as a preference, but as a moral obligation, a shield he held up not just for himself, but for them. And in doing so, he slowly calcified, becoming a creature of rigid habit, his days a meticulously built wall of predictability. The alarm clock, a digital tyrant, would blare its rude awakening at precisely 5:00 a.m., slicing through the brief, precious hours of sleep. Hector's feet would hit the cold kitchen linoleum, a shock that jolted him more effectively than the lukewarm coffee he'd nurse in silence. Maria, his wife, would still be asleep, a soft hum from the bedroom indicating her peaceful slumber. The kids, Alina and Leo, were cocooned in their own worlds, innocent of the relentless grind that waited for their father. He'd grab his lunch, usually a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, packed the night before, and a thermos of that same bitter coffee, then slip out the door. The familiar hum of the inherited minivan, the pre-dawn grayness of the working-class streets, the same potholes he dodged every morning. It was all a part of the ritual, a steady, unchanging rhythm that had swallowed years of his life whole. His work at the auto parts factory was a symphony of repetitive clang and hum. Station 17, assembling brake calipers. Thousands of them, every day. His hands, once quick and precise in a different way, now moved with the weary efficiency of a well-oiled machine, tightening bolts, fitting components, testing the release. The noise was constant, a numbing drone that made conversation impossible and thought a luxury. He'd lose himself in the rhythm, his mind blank save for the subtle shift of muscles, the weight of the tool, the faint ache in his lower back. Lunch break was a solitary affair, a quick bite in the noisy cafeteria, eyes scanning the worn pages of a newspaper or just staring blankly at the wall, wishing for the afternoon to somehow speed up. The afternoon drag was the worst, the minutes stretching into an eternity, each tick of the clock a tiny, almost imperceptible betrayal. When the shift finally ended, the sudden silence of the outside world felt deafening, a vacuum after hours of industrial roar. He'd get home, tired, often smelling faintly of metal and hydraulic fluid. Dinner with Maria, Alina, and Leo was a brief oasis, a forced normalcy where he'd try to shake off the factory dust, both literal and metaphorical. He'd nod along as Alina recounted her day at school, or listen to Leo's animated tales about a new video game offering grunts and half-smiles. But even then, the shadow of the factory floor never quite lifted. The money was always just enough. Always. There was the mortgage on the modest, slightly run-down house they'd inherited, the utilities, the car insurance, Alina's school trips, Leo's new sneakers. Every month was a delicate balancing act, a tightrope walk where one unexpected bill, a leaky pipe, a car repair, a sick kid, could send them tumbling. He was the anchor, the steady hand on the rudder, ensuring they stayed afloat, but it meant there was no room for error, no space for whims, and certainly no tolerance for risks. Stability, he told himself, was freedom. But lately, it felt more like a cage, albeit one he'd built with his own two hands, brick by monotonous brick. Deep inside, beneath the layers of oil and fatigue, lived another Hector. A Hector who remembered the joy of shaping wood, the satisfaction of a perfectly joined seam, the quiet hum of a sanding machine in a small, imagined workshop. The intricate sketches of furniture of a rocking horse for Leo, a vanity for Alina, still lay hidden in that shoebox under the bed, gathering dust. They were echoes of a forgotten ambition, whispering of a path not taken. He'd always dismissed them as youthful folly, impractical dreams for a practical man. But sometimes, when he was alone, lying awake in the dark, the whispers grew louder. They reminded him of the gap between the man he was, dutifully assembling brake calipers, and the man he could have been, crafting beauty with his own hands. The quiet ambition, the yearning for something more than just survival, was a ghost in his own house, haunting the edges of his sleep. He'd push it down, tell himself it was selfish, irresponsible. But the truth was, he was afraid. Afraid of failing, yes, but even more so, afraid of trying and finding out that the dream wasn't enough, that he wasn't enough. Better to keep it locked away, a precious, unblemished secret, than to expose it to the harsh light of reality and watch it crumble. The constant, gnawing ache of what if was a heavy burden, a quiet thief stealing pieces of his soul, one silent regret at a time. It was the price he paid for the illusion of safety, for the comfort of the known. It was the price he paid for the illusion of safety, for the comfort of the known. Then, one Tuesday evening, the illusion shattered. Alina came home, not with her usual burst of teenage energy, but with a quiet slump to her shoulders. She barely touched her dinner, pushing the peas around her plate with a fork. Hector, ever observant, caught Maria's worried glance across the table. After the kids were excused and Leo had scampered off to his room, Alina lingered. She fiddled with a napkin, her gaze fixed on the worn pattern of the tablecloth. Finally, she slid a crumpled envelope across the table towards Hector. It wasn't a heavy, official-looking letter from some university. It was lighter, thinner, a standard business envelope hand-addressed. His brow furrowed as he picked it up. Inside, there was no letter, just a single, glossy brochure for a prestigious art school, tucked behind a printout of an email. The email was a generic response to an inquiry, a polite affirmation of their high standards and competitive admissions process. It wasn't a rejection letter in the formal sense, but Alina's face told a different story. I found their website last month, she started, her voice barely a whisper, a tremor he hadn't heard before. They have this amazing program, furniture design, like making things out of wood, building stuff, Dad, not just drawing, but creating. She gestured vaguely, her hand shaking slightly. Hector's heart gave a strange, painful lurch. Furniture design, wood, his own secret dreams whispered back to him through his daughter's hopeful, then deflated words. It looked incredible, she continued, her eyes glistening. I filled out the preliminary application form online. I even started sketching some ideas for a rocking chair like the one you always said you'd build for me. The mention of his long-forgotten promise was a needle in his gut. But then I didn't send it. The tuition, the living costs, it's just so much. And I knew it was too risky, too expensive. Mom and you already work so hard. It just seemed selfish. And probably a waste of time anyway. I probably wouldn't have gotten in. It was a long shot. She finished, her voice trailing off, and then looked up at him. And in her eyes, Hector didn't see the petulant frustration of a denied teenager, but something far more profound and chilling. He saw a quiet, mature regret, the kind that settled deep into the bones and stayed there, hardening with time. It was the same regret he saw in the mirror every morning, reflected in the tired lines around his own eyes, echoing in the unused potential of his own hands. The words she'd used, too risky, too expensive, selfish, waste of time, wouldn't have gotten in, long shot, they were his own internal monologue, his own excuses, perfectly parroted by his daughter. His fear, his aversion to risk, wasn't just his own burden anymore. He had taught it to her subtly, unconsciously, like a sickness passed down through generations. He had shielded her from the pain of failure, but in doing so, he had exposed her to the far deeper, colder pain of not even trying. The look on her young face, bearing the weight of a regret that wasn't even truly hers, was a blow that knocked the wind out of him, 1,000 times harder than any personal failure he'd ever experienced or avoided. That night, the house was silent save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and Maria's steady breathing beside him. Hector lay flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, the numbers on the digital clock glowing an insistent, unforgiving 3:00 a.m. Sleep was a million miles away, lost in the raw, churning torment of his mind. Alina's face, etched with that adult regret, was burned behind his eyelids. Her words, his words, echoed in the oppressive quiet. Too risky, too expensive, selfish, probably wouldn't have gotten in. A long shot. He built a fortress of caution, brick by quiet brick, convincing himself he was protecting his family, protecting himself from the sting of failure. But what had he really done? He hadn't protected them from pain, he'd merely exchanged one kind for another. The sharp, momentary pain of falling short, of trying and not quite making it, that felt almost preferable now to this dull, ceaseless ache, this gnawing regret that had infected his daughter too. He saw it all with brutal clarity. His own life, a tapestry of safe choices, of paths not taken, of dreams meticulously boxed away. He had chosen the known discomfort over the terrifying uncertainty. He had clung to stability like a drowning man to a life raft, only to find himself adrift in a sea of what-ifs. Every cautious decision, every opportunity waved away with a shrug and a muttered excuse about responsibility, now felt like a betrayal. Not just to himself, but to Alina, to Leo, to Maria. He'd given them the illusion of security, but he'd also shown them, by example, the suffocating cost of a life lived too small, too afraid. He saw the years ahead if nothing changed. Alina carrying her quiet regret into adulthood, Leo perhaps learning the same lesson. His own quiet burden suddenly felt like a monstrous inheritance. The factory whistle would blow again in a few hours, calling him back to the familiar assembly line, back to the same motions, the same thoughts. But something had fundamentally shifted. The quiet peace he'd always found in avoidance was gone, replaced by a searing, undeniable truth. The greatest risk he'd ever taken was not taking any risks at all. And the price he was paying for that was everything. He didn't know what this meant, not exactly. No grand plan coalesced in the pre-dawn quiet of his living room. No sudden, brilliant flash of insight on how to undo decades of careful, calculated avoidance. He didn't have a map, no clear destination in mind. But what he did know, with a certainty that settled deep in his very bones, was that he couldn't keep going like this. The cumulative weight of his inaction, the silent betrayal of his own spirit, the horrifying echo of his fear in Alina's quiet, accepting regret, it was simply too much to bear anymore. The familiar, comfortable discomfort of the known, the well-trodden path he'd always chosen, had transformed, in that agonizing moment, into an unbearable torment. He couldn't look at Maria, or Leo, or especially Alina, and offer them a future built on the same shaky foundation of stifled dreams and unspoken regrets. He couldn't let the quiet burden he carried become their inheritance. An internal switch, long rusted in place by years of neglect and self-deception, had finally, irrevocably flipped. Enough. It wasn't a shout, not an angry declaration against the world, but a whisper firm and unyielding, born of exhaustion and a sudden, fierce protectiveness of the little hope still flickering inside him. He didn't know how to start. He didn't know what came next. But he knew, with a clarity that stung his eyes and tightened his throat, that he absolutely had to. He had to try, for them, for himself. The next morning, the 5 a.m. alarm still ripped him from a restless sleep, its insistent blare a familiar torment. The worn-out jeans and faded work shirt still waited on the chair, a uniform of his reliable, unchanging existence. The rich, dark smell of Maria's coffee still perfumed the small kitchen, a comfort he'd always taken for granted. Everything on the surface was exactly the same. But inside Hector, a different current now ran, a restless hum of anticipation mingled with dread. He swallowed his breakfast, the usual bland toast tasting like ash in his mouth. He kissed Maria's cheek, the goodbye kiss feeling heavier, fraught with an unshared truth, a secret burden he was now determined to shed. As he walked out the door, the chill morning air biting at his face, the old impulse to just go, to just do the same thing he always did, was almost overwhelming. His mind conjured a dozen well-worn reasons to turn back, to ignore the quiet roar in his chest. It's too late, Hector. You're too old. It's too hard. What good would it do? You'll just fail, and then where will you be? Worse off than before. He got into his old pickup, the engine groaning to life with a familiar, reluctant cough. The route to the factory was etched into his very being, a muscle memory developed over 3 decades. Left turn at the corner, straight for 3 blocks, right at the old diner, another left into the plant parking lot. He felt the phantom pull of the steering wheel, the invisible grooves of the familiar path calling him, promising the safety of routine. But then, as he reached the first corner, his foot hesitated on the brake pedal. His hands, usually so sure, so precise on the wheel, felt stiff, alien, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor running through them. The little voice of caution, the one that had guided him for decades, that had kept him safe and small, screamed at him to make the left, to follow the path of least resistance, to not rock the boat, to just be Hector, the dependable factory man, the man who didn't ask for more. But then he saw Alina's face again, that quiet, mature regret that had mirrored his own soul. He felt the cold, empty ache of, what if? In his own gut, a weight far heavier than any fear of failure. And with a sudden, deliberate movement that startled even himself, a stark rejection of the gravitational pull of his past, he turned the wheel right. It was only a block out of his way, a detour that added perhaps 3 minutes to his total drive time. a mere blip on the radar of his long commute. But it wasn't about the time. It was about the direction. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the cab. He felt a jolt of fear, raw and immediate, the kind he hadn't felt in years, not since he was a boy daring himself to jump off the high dive at the public pool. And this fear, he realized, this tightening in his chest, this clammy sweat on his palms, was exactly what he had spent a lifetime avoiding. But now it wasn't paralyzing. It was a sign that he was doing something different, something new. The turn took him past the old community center, a squat brick building he'd driven by 1,000 times without a second thought, his gaze always fixed forward, on the factory, on the known. And for the first time, Hector actually looked at it. He slowed slightly, his eyes scanning the faded notice, board advertising evening classes, a basic accounting course, a welding certification, and then, almost hidden by a curling corner, a flyer for an Introduction to Woodworking class. 8 weeks, Tuesday nights. No experience necessary. Woodworking. He hadn't touched a saw for anything more than a quick repair job in years, not since his dad used to let him tinker in the garage on Saturdays. He remembered the smell of sawdust, the satisfying weight of a chisel in his hand. A distant memory almost forgotten, but something in the simple words on the flyer, "Create with your hands," resonated with the ghost of a dream he'd locked away decades ago. He pulled over, heart still hammering, and copied down the number. The car idled, the engine a low hum against the frantic buzz inside his head. It was done. He'd done something different. The next morning, the brave feeling had evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. The phone number on the scrap of paper in his lunchbox felt like a judgment. All day, the rhythm of the machines at the factory seemed to mock him, the repetitive clang a reminder of the rut he was trying to climb out of. He kept telling himself it was stupid. What was he going to do with woodworking? Make birdhouses? He had bills to pay, a family to feed. This was a childish indulgence, a reckless waste of time and money. After his shift, he sat in the truck in the parking lot, the engine off, the keys still in the ignition. His thumb traced the worn edges of the paper. Maria would wonder. The kids would scoff. He could just toss it, pretend it never happened. No one had to know. He could go back to being Hector, the dependable factory man. But then Elena's face flashed in his mind, the quiet devastation in her eyes as she tucked that art school pamphlet back into its envelope. The hollow ache returned. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and dialed. A nervous, trembling finger. The phone rang 3 times before a cheerful voice answered. "Community Center, how can I help you?" Hector swallowed, his voice a gravelly whisper. I saw your flyer." For the woodworking class. That first Tuesday night, Hector almost didn't go. He told Maria he was working late, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. He pulled into the community center parking lot, his palms sweating, his stomach doing flips. He watched people walk in, younger folks mostly, some women all looking eager, unburdened by the weight of a lifetime of missed chances. He felt like an imposter. His hand was on the door handle, ready to reverse out, when he saw an old man, probably in his 70s, struggling with a small toolbox, his steps slow but determined. Something in the man's persistent shuffle sparked a stubborn defiance in Hector. If that old-timer could do it, so could he. He swallowed his pride, pushed open the door, and walked inside. The class was awkward. He felt clumsy, his hands, so used to the precise, repetitive movements of machinery, struggled with the nuances of a hand plane. The instructor, a burly man named Frank with a kind smile, patiently showed him how to hold the chisel, how to read the grain of the wood. Hector made mistakes, lots of them. He gouged a piece of oak he was supposed to be smoothing, his frustration a hot flush on his neck. He felt the familiar pull of inadequacy, the urge to shrink back into the shadows, to declare it all a foolish mistake and quit. He looked around. Everyone else seemed to be picking it up quicker, their cuts cleaner, their joints tighter. His chest felt heavy with the familiar weight of not being good enough. The second week wasn't much better. He still felt like the slowest student in the room, his projects looking rougher, less refined than the others. He'd leave class feeling deflated, the initial spark dwindling to a flicker. Maria asked him about the extra hours, and he mumbled vague answers, feeling the knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. He'd spend the next few days dreading the next session, his mind conjuring every reason not to go. It was too far. He was tired. He wasn't learning fast enough. He was wasting time he should be spending on real work. He had almost convinced himself that quitting was the sensible thing to do, that he was simply recognizing a bad investment of his precious time. But then, He'd see the small, rough wooden block he was supposed to be turning into a decorative box lid, sitting on his workbench at home. It was ugly, uneven, but it was his. He'd pick it up, feel the grain under his calloused thumb. And he'd remember Alina's face, not just the regret, but the quiet determination she possessed, a trait he knew she'd inherited from him. He couldn't look her in the eye and tell her to chase her dreams if he wasn't even willing to keep showing up for his own pathetic attempt. He'd stand there, staring at that block of wood, the weight of a lifetime of almosts pressing down on him. The fear of failure was still there, a dull ache in his stomach. But something else was growing alongside it now, a new, sharp pain. The pain of imagining himself a year from now, looking back on this moment, knowing he'd let the chance slip away, not because he couldn't do it, but because he just gave up. And that pain, he realized, felt worse. Far worse than the clumsy cuts, worse than the wasted wood, worse than the knowing looks he imagined from his classmates. He found himself every Tuesday night, despite the struggle, despite the doubt, back in that community center, tools in hand, ready to try again. Each time he walked in a little taller, not because it was getting easier, but because he was refusing to quit. The early weeks of the woodworking class were a relentless grind. Hector would come home smelling of sawdust and the bitter tang of defeat, his hands aching with cuts and splinters, his patience worn thin. Maria, ever observant, would just watch him, a quiet question in her eyes that he rarely met. Alina, bless her heart, would sometimes sneak a peek at his latest, lopsided creation, her young face trying hard to suppress a wince. "Looks, interesting, Dad," she'd offer a little too brightly. He knew what she meant. He saw the same barely concealed disappointment he used to feel looking at his own life. But then, somewhere around the 5th or 6th Tuesday, as the days grew shorter and the autumn air bit sharper, something shifted. It wasn't a grand revelation, not a sudden burst of hidden talent that transformed him into a master craftsman overnight. It was smaller, almost imperceptible, like the faint scent of rain before the storm. He was working on a simple joint, a dovetail that had mocked him for weeks, its angles refusing to align, the wood stubbornly tearing instead of shearing cleanly. This night, instead of fighting the grain with his usual brute force, trying to impose his will, he stopped. He leaned back on his stool, took a deep, shuddering breath, and just looked at the piece of pine. He ran a calloused thumb along the imperfect cut he'd made, felt the rough edges. He thought about the instructor's quiet, almost whispered advice. "The wood will tell you what it wants, Hector, if you just listen." He picked up a freshly sharpened chisel, the steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He adjusted his stance, remembered the subtle tilt of the wrist, the gentle push instead of the heavy hammer. And this time, instead of the familiar frustration, a different sensation took hold. He wasn't just cutting, he was feeling. He was listening. A tiny sliver curled away clean, then another, almost like peeling an apple. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it wasn't a disaster either. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a genuine one that stretched muscles unused to the motion. The instructor, Mr. Henderson, a wiry man with hands like old oak roots, walked by, paused. "There you go, Hector," he murmured, his voice as smooth as sandpaper on fine wood. "Finding the rhythm. Letting the tool do the work." Hector just nodded, but inside a tiny spark flickered, warm and persistent. It wasn't just a physical act anymore, it was a conversation. At home, Maria noticed it first. The heavy silence that had typically settled over him after work had lightened. He was still tired, yes, his shoulders still slumped, but there was a new energy simmering beneath the surface. He'd talk a little more about his day, even about a difficult cut or a stubborn piece of wood, not with resignation, but with a hint of challenge in his voice, almost an eagerness to go back and conquer it. One evening, Leo, who usually just hovered over his gaming console, actually came over to the workbench in the garage, drawn by the new sounds of sanding and tapping. "Whatcha mackin', Dad?" Hector didn't just grunt or wave him off. He showed him the piece, explained the tricky joint, imperfections and all. Leo even asked to hold a hand plane, his small fingers tracing the sharp blade. Hector found himself explaining the grain, the push, the pull. It was a simple moment, but powerful. The dust in the neglected corners of his life, the one he'd let accumulate for decades, felt like it was finally stirring, caught in a rising draft. Hope wasn't a roaring fire yet, just a warm ember, but it was there, glowing steadily, promising light. Weeks turned into a couple of months. The single, sad block of wood on his workbench had multiplied. There were now two small, albeit still imperfect, decorative boxes. One, he decided, for Maria, still rough around the edges, but clearly made with careful intention, the joints surprisingly tight. Another he was meticulously crafting for Alina, even planning a small, intricate relief carving for the lid. A mountain because she loved to draw landscapes and dreamed of seeing them. His hands, once just tools for lifting and assembling the same repetitive parts on the factory line, now held a different kind of wisdom. They still bore the calloused marks of hard labor, but they moved with a new precision, a focused intention, each movement less about brute force and more about understanding. At the factory, the change was subtle, yet noticeable to those who paid attention. He still punched in at the same ungodly hour, still operated the same machines, still heard the same monotonous hum. But the deep-set weariness had lessened its grip, replaced by a quiet vigilance. He found himself looking at the assembly line with fresh eyes, offering suggestions on the process, small adjustments he'd never dared to voice before, always fearing it would be seen as overstepping or an invitation for ridicule. Maybe if we angled this jig differently, the feed would be smoother, he'd suggest to his foreman, a grizzled man named Frank who rarely offered praise. Frank, to Hector's surprise, actually grunted, considered it, then later implemented the idea. "Good thinking, Hector," he'd admitted, a rare flicker of respect in his eyes. Hector started to look around, not just at the task immediately in front of him, but at the bigger picture. He noticed problems, yes, but now he also saw potential solutions, ideas forming, where before he just let them die unspoken. He even started a small notebook, tucked into his lunch pail, jotting down these thoughts, these flashes of insight he'd previously dismissed as mere distractions. At home, the garage became more than just a place to park Maria's old sedan. It was a workshop, a sanctuary, a quiet hum of purpose that extended beyond the factory's relentless rhythm. The mountain relief carving for Alina's art box slowly took shape under his patient hands, each line carefully considered, each curve coaxed from the stubborn wood. He felt a different kind of tired now, a satisfying ache in his shoulders and forearms that spoke of creation, not just endurance. Maria noticed the subtle shift first. She'd always seen the quiet determination in her husband, but now there was a spark in his eyes that had been dormant for years, a light that mirrored the faint sawdust clinging to his shirts. She saw him talking more, not just about the bills or the broken faucet, but about an idea for a better way to organize the tools or a funny thing Leo said at school. Even the way he ate his dinner seemed different, less like fuel for the next shift and more like a shared meal. Days turned into weeks. The art box for Alina was finished, a humble masterpiece born of quiet love and newfound courage. Alina gasped when she saw it, tracing the intricate mountain range with a soft reverence. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with surprise and admiration, "this is incredible." It wasn't just the box. It was the story behind it, the silent declaration that some dreams were worth pursuing. The small act of building something beautiful, something just because it could be beautiful, had ripple effects. Hector started fixing things around the house that had been broken for years, a squeaky door, a leaky faucet that had been a constant drip in the background of their lives. Each repair was a small victory, a testament to taking action instead of just enduring. Then came the day a notice went up on the factory bulletin board, a posting for a new supervisor position in their department. It wasn't a huge jump, but it was a step up, requiring more initiative, more problem-solving. A year ago, Hector would have scoffed, dismissed it as not for him, or too much paperwork. But now, standing in front of it, he felt a strange pull. He thought of Alina, of her quietly spoken regret, of the box in her room, of the small, triumphant mountain carved into its lid. He thought of the notes in his lunch pail, the small suggestions he'd offered Frank, the quiet pride he'd felt when they were implemented. He looked at his hands, no longer just the hands of a weary factory worker, but the hands of a man who built, who created, who dared to try. He applied. It wasn't easy. There were interviews, questions about leadership, about problem-solving under pressure, things he'd only ever considered from the safe distance of the assembly line. He stumbled on some answers, felt the old fear of failure try to creep back in, but he kept talking, kept sharing the ideas he'd once silenced. And a few weeks later, Frank pulled him aside, a rare, almost smile on his face. "Hector," he said, "they're giving you the shot. You start next Monday." Hector, the man who'd carried a quiet burden for so long, felt something akin to lightness bloom in his chest. He was still Hector, still punching in at the same factory, still coming home to the same modest house. But his eyes were different. They held a different kind of knowing now, a hard-won wisdom that spoke of lessons learned not just from books, but from the raw material of life itself. He saw the world with new clarity, recognizing the patterns of his past self in others, but also seeing the latent potential. He wasn't afraid to step forward anymore. He understood now. He used to think if he didn't try, he couldn't fail. That was a lie he'd told himself, a comfortable cage built of fear. But not trying, that was the real failure. And the regret of not even putting your hat in the ring, of standing on the sidelines watching your life go by, that was a damn heavy thing to carry, heavier than any box of parts, heavier than any shift, heavier than any imagined defeat. Trying and failing, well, that just meant you learned something. But not trying at all, that just meant you never lived. So there was a man, Hector, who finally understood that the true cost of avoiding risk wasn't safety, but the slow, agonizing death of what might have been. He learned that the greatest risk was not taking any at all, and that the only true protection against